Welcome to Tactic Devs. In today's video, we take a look at Adorners in WPF. An easy way to think of Adorners is that they are interactive UI visuals that provide additional means to interact with the primary UI elements. They are mostly used to highlight and emphasize specific regions in the UI, as well as to provide visual cues to a user. They are rendered in an Adorner layer, which is a rendering surface that is always placed on top of the adorned element. Think of it as a transparent layer drawn above all UI elements. The Adorner class defined in WPF allows us to create custom adorners that we can then use to overlay visuals on top of existing UI elements. In this video, we take a look at how to implement an adorner that will be used to resize a UI control. So with that being said, let's go to Visual Studio and get to the coding. Alright, so here in Visual Studio, I already have a WPF project set up. I'll start by creating a custom adorner that I'm going to be using to resize a UI control. So I'll add a class to the project. And I'll name this class Resize. Adorner. I'll change this class to a public class and I'll inherit from the Adorner class. Now the Adorner class is defined in a different namespace, so I'll go ahead and add that namespace. Now here it requires that we implement a constructor. So I'll go ahead and do that. Alright, so here we have a constructor that takes in a single parameter of the type UI element. Now when an instance of this Adorner class is created, it's going to be associated to the element that will be passed through the constructor. Now one thing to note is that the Adorner class does not have inherent rendering code by default. This means it doesn't know how to render itself onto the screen. So to ensure that the Adorner is rendered onto the screen, we have to implement the rendering code ourselves. So I'll be going through step by step on how to implement the rendering. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable of the type visual collection. So I'll add in the namespace where this class is defined and I'll give it a name. I'll say Adorner Visuals. Alright, now this visual collection is going to store a bunch of visual objects. Now visual objects are simply objects that can be rendered onto the screen. Now the UI controls that are defined in WPF actually inherit from the visual class. So anything capable of being rendered onto the screen is a visual. So I'll be storing some visuals that will be associated to this Adorner inside this collection. Now this collection will be very useful for us to implement the rendering. So here in the constructor, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an instance. So I'll say Adorner Visuals is equal to a new collection. And the constructor of this visual collection requires that we pass in the parent. Now in this case, the parent of the visuals that will be associated with this Adorner is actually the Adorner itself. So I'll just specify this keyword. Right. Now I'll be placing two UI controls on the top left and the bottom right corner of the UI element that's going to be adorned. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify two variables here of the type thumb. I'll add in the namespace where the thumb control is defined. Now the reason I decide to use the thumb control is because it supports dragging. Now, because I'll be dragging to resize the UI element, I'm going to be using the thumb control. So what I'm going to do is I'll create two thumbs. So I'll say thumb 1 and thumb 2. So in the constructor here, I'm going to create instances. So say thumb 1 is equals to a new thumb. So I'll set the background color to a shade of orange. So I'll say, and I'll set the height and width to 10 pixels. Alright, so here we have thumb 1, and I'll just copy and paste this, and I'll do the same for thumb 2. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add these two thumbs to the Adorner visual collection here. So I'll say Adorner visuals, so I'll add them to that collection. So I'll say add thumb 1 and I'll do the same for thumb 2. Now, to ensure that the Adorner and its associated visuals are rendered onto the screen, I'll be overriding some methods. So I'll be overriding the first method, which is say override. Then I'll say get visual child. Now this method is used during the layout process. So when this Adorner is being rendered onto the screen, it actually calls this method. And this method gets the children or the visuals associated with the Adorner. So I'll be replacing this code. So I'll simply call the collection that I created and I'll get the visuals in that collection. So I'll specify the index here. So I'll be overriding another property, and this is the visual child count. So this property returns the number of visuals. So in this case, I'll be replacing this code. So I'll simply get the Adorners visual collection and I'll return the count. So these two overridden methods are important because they participate in the rendering process. So by overriding, I'm simply specifying that when rendering this Adorner, simply get the visuals from this collection. Now, there's another method that I'll be overriding, and that's the arrange override method. So say override. Now this method is useful because it's within this method that I can now arrange the visuals. So these two thumbs that I have, I'll now be writing some logic inside this method to actually arrange them on where they're going to be placed relative to the element that will be adorned. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say thumb 1, then I'll call the arrange method. Now this method takes in a rect, which is a rectangle that it's going to use to render it onto the screen. So I'll say new rect, and it takes in 4 parameters. So the first one is the location. So I'll say 0, 0. And the second parameters are the height and width. So I'll say 10 pixels by 10 pixels. So by simply specifying the rectangle here, I'm simply saying place this thumb at 0,0 and its height and width will be 10 pixels. Now when we call this method, it's going to arrange this thumb relative to this UI element that we are passing through the constructor. Okay, so I'll do the same for the second thumb. Say thumb 2. Now one thing to note, if I place it at 0,0, I'm placing it at the top left corner. Now for the second thumb, I would like to place it at the right bottom corner. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say adorned element. So I'll get the element that's being adorned and I'll get its desired width. So simply place this according to the width of the adorned element. So I'll do the same for the height. I'll say adorned. Then I'll say desired size. I'll get the height. I'll use the same size, 10 pixels. Alright, so apparently we now have the Adorner here. So what I'll do is I'll go to the main window here and I'm going to add a button to the grid. So I'll say button. I'll say height 50 pixels and width 50. I'll say horizontal alignment. I'll set that to center and I'll set the vertical alignment to center. I'll name this button. I'll give it a name. I'll assign it my button. I'll do the same for the grid. I'll say my grid. Alright, so I'll go to the code behind here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm now going to add the Adorner to the button. Now for me to add the Adorner to the button, I need to add it to the Adorner layer. So I now need to access the Adorner layer. Now one thing to note is that the Adorner layer is only made available when the window has been fully loaded. So I'm going to subscribe to the loaded event. Then I'll say Adorner layer. So the Adorner layer class has got a static method called get Adorner layer. And here I can specify the visual element that I want to get the Adorner layer for. So in this case, I'll get it from the grid. So I'll say my grid. Then once I have the Adorner layer, I can add an Adorner. So I'll say add. So in this case, I'm going to add a resize Adorner. So I'll say new resize Adorner. Now in my resize Adorners constructor, I now need to specify the element that I want to associate this Adorner with. So in this case, I'll set it to my button. And that's it. So I'll go ahead and run this code. Alright, and there we have it. We now have a button and we have two thumbs placed at 0,0 and the other thumb is placed according to the width and height of the button. Now we can try to drag, nothing happens, it doesn't resize. So I'll be closing this up and I'll be now implementing the logic to resize the control. So I'll go back to the Resize Adorner class. Here in the constructor, what I'm going to do is I'm going to subscribe to an event that's defined on the thumb class. So I'll say thumb1, then I'll say drag delta. So I'll subscribe to this event. Now drag delta simply means that when we drag, it's going to record the change in the dragging. So we can use that change to now resize the UI element that's been adorned. So I'll do the same for the second thumb. Alright, so we have two events, thumb1 and thumb2. Alright, so for thumb1, what I'm going to do is I'll say adorned. So I'll create a variable instead. So I'll say element. So I'll say adorned element. So we get the element that's been adorned, and I'll cast this element to a framework element. So since it's a UI element, I'll now cast it to a framework element. The reason I'm casting it to a framework element is because I want to access the height and width property. So once I do that, I'll say element, then I'll get the height, then I'll say the height will be equal to the original height plus the change according to the dragging. Now we can get the change of the drag by using this argument passed in the event handler. So I'll say E, then I'll get the vertical change since we are dealing with the height. So the height will be equal to the height plus the change. Now one thing to note is that when the height is less than 0, maybe -5, it's going to raise an exception and the application will simply crash. So to prevent that, we can write an if-else statement to ensure that it doesn't go below 0. So I'm going to do that using a ternary operator. So I'll simply say less than 0. So if the element's height plus the change is less than 0, then set the height to 0. So don't go below 0, just set it to 0. Else, if it's not less than 0, then return the element's height plus the change. So I'll copy and paste. I'll do the same for the width. And this time we use the horizontal change because we are dealing with the width. Now what's happening here, it's simply we are just writing an if-else statement, the shorthand of writing an if-else statement. So we are simply saying if the element's height plus the change is less than 0, if it's a negative number, then just set it to 0. Else, set it to the height plus the change. So we are doing the same for the width. Now one thing to note is that we are setting this event handler for the thumb, which is thumb1. Now we can go to the arrange method here, and we note that thumb 1 is placed at the top left corner. So this means when we drag it to the right, it's actually going to increase the size instead of reduce the size. So what I'm going to do is I'll copy this code and place it in thumb 2, in the event handler for thumb 2. And for thumb 1, I'll change this to a negative, because we have two thumbs on the opposite sides. So one thumb will be subtracting when moving towards the left, the other thumb will be adding when moving towards the left. Okay, so here we have the logic. So what's happening here is when the thumb is dragged, this event handler will be raised and executed, and will now set the height based on the change of the drag. So let's go ahead and try this code. Alright, so I'll try to drag, and there we have it. We can now resize the UI element. See, when I move towards the right, it's reducing the size, but for this one, when I move towards the right, it's increasing. So that's the reason we have a negative and a positive in the event handlers. So if I move towards the left for this thumb, it's increasing, but if I move towards the left for this thumb, it's reducing. So that's the reason we need to have a negative here and a positive there. If you misplace these, you notice that the behavior will be somewhat different. Now we notice that the thumbs are slightly placed off. The reason for that is right here in the arrange method, we set it to 0,0, and we know that WPF, when rendering, considers 0,0 as the top left corner. So we can actually offset this by half the width and height. So I'll say -5, -5. Then for this, I'll do the same. I'll say -5, -5. So let's go ahead and try this. Alright, so we have them placed exactly where we want them. Now, I would like to add a border around this UI element. So a dotted line around this UI element. So I'll close this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new visual. This time it will be a rectangle. So I'll say rectangle, and I'll add in the namespace where it's defined, which is System Windows Shapes. And I'll create an instance right here. So I'll say rec is equal to a new rectangle. I'll set the fill to a shade of orange. In fact, I'll set the fill to none, but I'll set the stroke to a shade of orange. So I'll say stroke. Then I'll set the stroke thickness to 2 pixels. And the dash array. So I'll set it to an array of doubles. So I'll say 3,2. So the dash will be 3 pixels and the line will be 2 pixels. So it's going to create that dotted line. So I have this rectangle, and I'll now add it to the collection as part of the Adorner. So I'll say add. Then I'll add the rectangle. So the rectangle is added, but it now needs to be placed and arranged. So I'll go to the arrange override here, and I'll say rectangle, then I'll call the arrange method. I'll specify the rectangle to use. In this case, I'm going to place it half of the thumbs. So I'll say minus 2.5, comma, minus 2.5. Then I'll say the Adorner's desired width, since I want it to stretch to the size of the element being adorned. Then I'll say minus 2.5. I'll do the same for the height. Say height minus 2.5. So simply what's happening here is that we are arranging the rectangle by placing it, we are offsetting it by 2.5. And the length and the height, the width, and the height will be based on the width of the adorned element. Then we are offsetting it by 2.5 as well. So once I set this in the arrange here, when I resize the element, it's going to automatically resize the rectangle. So this is the initial position. So go ahead and try the code. All right, and we have a rectangle there. But you can notice that it's slightly off here. So instead of subtracting, I'm now going to add 2.5. Let's give it a try. So here I'll add, and I'll add 2.5. All right, let's give it a try. All right, and it draws it just exactly on the line. So we need to add 5 instead of 2.5. All right, let's go ahead and try. Okay, slightly better. And here we now have the Adorner. So we can now resize. However, I do not like how these two thumbs appear. How do I correct this? I can simply override the default style. Okay, I'll close this. I'll go to the app.xaml file, and here I'm going to define a style. So I'll say style, and it's going to target the thumb type. And I'll define a setter in the style, and the setter will target a property which is the template. And I'll say setter, and I'll set the value of the template. So in this case, I'm going to set the value to a control template. And in the control template, I'm now going to define a rectangle. And I'll set the fill to a template binding. So I'll simply get the fill from whatever element is going to be the thumb. So I'll get it from the actual thumb that's going to use this template. So I'll say, I'll get the fill. So I'll get the background property. Then for the height and width, I'll do the same. So I'll get it from the thumb that's going to be using this template. and that should do it. So I'll go ahead and try this. And here we see we now have rectangles. So I can resize that. We can actually change the style of this to something like an ellipse. So let's say ellipse. Now an ellipse has a fill, height, width. Okay, so I'll go ahead and run the code. And there we have it. The thumbs are now ellipse. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Remember to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel. I'll see you in the next one.